All right, so we've looked at prefixes, which are short URLs that go into RSS feeds and track episode downloads. Now we're going to look at pixels, which are long URLs that go into ad servers that track ad downloads. So let's get started. I'm going to show you one. It's quite long, kind of ugly. Here is a pixel, and here are the components of it. It looks kind of complicated, but you'll start to notice patterns if you stare at it for long enough. So you'll notice there are lots of question marks. There are lots of ampersands that keep popping up. Here, here, here. There are lots of equal signs that keep popping up. And then there are lots of percentage signs that keep popping up. So keep those in mind. And now we're going to format it in a way that makes it seem more approachable. The way that we'll do that is we're going to take the ampersands, and every time we see an ampersand, we're going to press enter and return the rest of the line to return the rest of the URL to a new line. So this is what happens when you do that. This is what the pixel then starts to look like. So here you can see it's a lot cleaner than before. You can see that there's one section here. I forgot to make a new layer. There's one section here for the domain. So all of the data below will go to that domain. In other words, Podscribe. Then we have the advertiser name, client, CL name, delivery time, episode ID, event type. Notice how you can actually read the individual query parameters here. That's why it's so helpful to separate them. So let's get started. Query parameter. Each of these lines is a query parameter below here. This is not a query parameter. A query parameter is a section of a URL that contains information that is then sent to the domain here. A query parameter has two things. It has a key and it has a value. And you'll notice that the keys and values in each of these query parameters is separated by an equal sign. Okay? So here the key, and I'll do this with color, the key here is advertiser, the key here is client, the key here is CL name, the key here is DT, the key here is PLT, so on and so forth. And then you can guess what the values are. The value here is element, the value here is BE, blah, 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 blah. The value here is bad friends Q2 test. The value here is delivery time. Now, not all values look like this. Some of them look like this, which have these two percentage signs beside them. 4 actually. When a value looks like this, it should be called a macro. Okay, so in this case, this is a macro, delivery time. Episode ID is a macro. IP here is a macro. Cache buster, macro. Podcast ID. This is not a macro. This is not a macro. This is not a macro. It's just a value. And UA for user agent is a macro. This is not a macro. Why? What does it mean for something to be a macro? It means that when the pixel fires, when it runs in the ad server, every time it fires, the macro is replaced with an actual value. It doesn't stay the same. So let's say this were to run, this pixel were to fire 10 different times. In each of those 10 different times, the advertiser will stay as element. The client will stay as BE596, blah, blah, blah. The CL name will stay as this, but the delivery time will change. When the first pixel fires, it might be 5 o'clock. When this pixel fires first, it might be 5 o'clock. The next fire will be at 5:01. The third, 5:02, so on and so forth. The point is that delivery time changes with every fire of this pixel. And the same goes for episode ID. Maybe the first download is of episode 10352. The second is of 69748. so on and so forth. The IP changes as well, cache buster. The macro is the value that changes every time the pixel fires. And there's actually an error that can pop up, or a flag, a red flag with a campaign that can pop up for clients in Podscribe that is called bad macro. This means that when this pixel was added to the ad server, for some reason, the macro is not, sorry, that's not a macro. The macro is not unfolding itself properly so that when the ad is inserted into a download, when the ad server is trying to fire the pixel, for some reason, the pixel is not changing these macros and it's sending back percent podcast ID percent instead of the actual value of the podcast on which the ad is being inserted, into which the ad is being inserted. So that is us kind of deconstructing a pixel. We can see that there are a bunch of different query parameters. Each of them has a key and a value, and the macros are the values in particular that are replaced, that are changed by the ad server for every fire of the pixel. Now, one last thing that I want to mention here is, why do we have some that are not changing? Why do we have some values that don't change and some values that do? The answer is because this is how we organize these impressions in our database. When we have hundreds of clients and billions of impressions that show up in our database. How do we figure out, imagine that these were all of the impressions in our database. How do we figure out which belong to Element, which belong to BetterHelp, which belong to Nike, which belong to McDonald's, so on and so forth? And the answer is we use these query parameters to organize that data. So, for example, here we have advertiser equals element. This means that of the total number of impressions in our system, we can then filter to see just the ones that came from element, where advertiser is equal to element. And then from there, we can further filter by client. So there are certain impressions that come from this particular client. A client is not necessarily the same as element. It could be an agency or an advertiser or a publisher, and we use the client parameter to figure out who on Podscribe has the right to see the results from this campaign. Where should these impressions go? To which accounts should these impressions go? So the client could be here, BE something something something. CL name here, that could be another circle in this database where only the impressions that come from the CL name bad friends blah 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 will show up. And then there's another one, megaphone, impressions where megaphone is the platform. And then there's also another one where there's iHeart. You get the point. The point is that every one of these query parameters contributes to us making it easier for us to find those small set of impressions that belong to one campaign associated with one advertiser and one client and one CL name. So that's why we have so many of these. It's because we can then drill down in our database to find the data. And then once we have figured out which client and advertiser we're looking at, we can then organize the impressions by episode and podcast and campaign more easily. So then you can see, this particular episode of this particular podcast from this run of network campaign got 10,000 impressions. And we know this because we have 10,000 of these impressions in our database from the pixel associated with that campaign. So that's why it is super helpful to have these query parameters in the pixel, and that's how they work. So now we've gone over what a query parameter is, why they are useful, how they are used in our database. I'm also going to say one last thing before I move to the computer here, and it's more of a question. Not every pixel will look like this. Every pixel will have different query parameters. Every pixel will have query parameters, but not every pixel will separate their query parameters using percentage signs or even and signs. Sometimes they might be different. Sometimes they might be brackets. Sometimes they might be, what's another example? Regular brackets. And so we're going to look at what changes and how that changes in a few seconds now.